Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is David Dixon. I'm Dean of the Law School at UNSW. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which this university is built, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders. Welcome to the annual lecture of the Australian Human Rights Centre. This lecture is part of the Law School's 40th anniversary programme. This is also the 25th anniversary, I believe, of the Australian Human Rights Centre. Its annual lecture is one of the real high points of our year. We have featured many great speakers, including David Malouf and Justice Albie Sachs. And this lecture is a key feature of the Centre's contribution to debate on matters of contemporary human rights significance. Tonight we're honoured to welcome the US Ambassador, Jeffrey Bleich, to deliver this lecture. It is a great honour for us, but of course having the Ambassador here always involves some security issues. As those of you who may have seen the Ambassador recently on Q&A, one of our concerns was about whether he was going to have a chance to deliver his lecture by himself tonight, and I'm very glad to say I've had a security check done and Kevin Rudd isn't in the building. We also offer a very warm welcome to the US Consul General, Niels Marquardt, the Commissioner of the International Commission of Justice, Elizabeth Evers, the President of the International Law Association, Damien Sturzaker, and everybody, friends and colleagues and students who are here tonight. Just one final point before moving on. Please, if you haven't already done so, turn off your phones. If you leave your phone on and it rings, one of the Ambassador's security detail will deal with you. To introduce our guest, please welcome the Director of the Australian Human Rights Centre, Associate Professor Andrea Durbeck. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and good evening, everybody, and a warm welcome to you all. Just as the new American ambassador to Australia was settling into his relaxed and comfortable diplomatic post, as apparently Australia is known in diplomatic circles, the director of WikiLeaks, Australian Julian Assange, began releasing over 250,000 leaked US State Department diplomatic cables into the public domain, a move which prompted a critically bold public response from the ambassador. And over the last week or so, as we've been in discussion with his embassy to make the final preparations for his visit to Sydney to deliver this address, Ambassador Bleich has been a key and frequent voice of America in Australia in the wake of Osama bin Laden's death. And tonight he has agreed to take up another challenge and address the United States and Australia's commitment to human rights in the Asia-Pacific region, a region of immense political, economic, cultural and political diversity and foreign policy controversy, a region that spans Afghanistan, China, Pakistan and North Korea. When Barack Obama ran for president, Jeffrey Bleich co-chaired his campaign in California, a state crucial to President Obama's eventual victory. At the time, the ambassador was quoted in the San Francisco Bar Journal as saying, "I'm not getting a lot of sleep this year." There's no doubt that in his short time in the role, Ambassador Bleich, as the Australian predicted, has brought an extraordinary energy to this diplomatic outpost, clearly putting paid to its laid-back reputation. A graduate in political science, public policy and law from Amherst College, Harvard and Berkeley, and law clerk to the Supreme Court's Chief Justice William Rehnquist, Ambassador Bleich was a litigation partner of the major San Francisco law firm for 14 years, serving as president of both the California State Bar and the San Francisco Bar Association. Outside of his legal practice, he worked at the Iran U.S. Claims Tribunal, and as Special Rapporteur to the International Court of Arbitration, he assisted the Special Prosecutor for the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. He has also served in numerous foreign policy organizations, including the Council on Foreign Relations, the Pacific Council on International Policy, the International Law Association, and Human Rights Watch. In March 2009, Ambassador Bleich, or Jeffrey Bleich, joined the White House staff as special counsel to the President, and in September that year, he was nominated by President Obama to become United States Ambassador to Australia. We are delighted to have you in our country, and that you have been able to address us this evening even more so. Please would you welcome Ambassador Jeffrey Bleich.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Durbach, for that lovely introduction, and thank you, Dean Dixon, as well. It's wonderful to see so many dignitaries here, and of course, my good friend and an inspiring figure in the law, Justice Kirby. Nice to see you here as well. This is, as Professor Durbach mentioned, I am a recovering lawyer. And the one thing that you worry about, the State Department worries about, is that I will lapse back into my legal role, because, as you may know, in many parts of society outside of legal practice, there is a general. It's not as though lawyers get the best treatment in society. I didn't think that you could actually fall lower on the societal food chain until I became a diplomat. And I discovered this great quote from John Adams, who was one of our nation's founding fathers, who said towards the end of his life, he said, "I've concluded after a lifetime of experience that one useless person is a waste. Two is a law firm, and three or more is a diplomatic corps." So I have managed to move down that food chain. I also want to thank Professor Andrew Burns and the faculty of the Australia Human Rights Center for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a great honor to have been invited to deliver this annual lecture and to participate with the Australian Human Rights Center, because this center and organizations like it have helped to strengthen national human rights institutions throughout the Asia Pacific. So I want to congratulate you on your work and hopefully contribute to the discussion here. Finally, I want to congratulate the University of New South Wales School of Law on your 40th anniversary and the Human Rights Center on your 25th anniversary. The principle that's advanced by human rights lawyers here and by the Human Rights Center is a fairly simple one, and it's based on an equally simple question. Why should a person living in any nation in the Asia Pacific be denied their basic human rights because of the country in which they were born, or the parents to whom they were born, or where their ancestors came from? While every nation is different and is free to govern according to different values and in different ways, the fact that people exist in one nation rather than another doesn't make them any less human. So why should a child who's born in North Korea or in Burma be prevented from doing the things that are essential to being human? Thinking for ourselves, being able to express our beliefs, and living without fear of being enslaved or harmed because we think differently or we look different than others. This principle is an article of faith for both of our nations, and it's been an essential part of our nation's laws and our foreign policy. The United States, in fact, was founded on this basic principle. In the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson began, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Jefferson's words have come to be reflected as universal values embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And in the United States and in Australia, these universal values are taken almost as an article of political faith. But the question is, why? Why do we believe that all people are endowed with these particular inalienable rights? And why do we seek to advance and defend these values, not only in our own countries, but in all nations? I'd like to talk about this today by first sharing some of my own reflections on the origins and meanings of these principles in U.S. history. That sound you hear is people in the State Department gulping. And then by reviewing how these influence the actions that the United States and Australia are currently pursuing in this region. In particular, I'd like to talk about our collective efforts in North Korea, in Burma, and in Fiji, countries that have vastly different histories and have arrived at markedly different, but no less challenging places in human rights and democracy in 2011. Because unless we understand the reason we hold these truths to be self-evident, unless we understand the legitimate basis for them, we can't really assess whether we're doing the right things or doing them well. So why are human rights part of our foreign policy? Why did Americans or Australians object when leaders of Burma incarcerated Aung San Suu Kyi, a pro-democracy leader with different views than those of the Burmese generals? Why do we insist that Kim Jong-il allow citizens of North Korea to communicate freely with people outside their country and throughout the world? Why do we sanction Fiji's leaders for shutting down voices of dissent and for barring elections? Why do we urge these nations to allow a free press and insist that these things are human rights, that these rights are universal? And indeed, we work to make them part of a universal Declaration of Human Rights in the UN. Just what gives our nations, the United States and Australia and like-minded nations, or the United Nations as a whole, a basis for recognizing these particular rights as extending across all borders, and to assert them whenever they are ignored or rejected? I think Thomas Jefferson stumbled over these very same questions. In fact, he actually didn't write the famous line that I quoted. Originally, he wrote, "We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable." The sentence was later changed by Benjamin Franklin. The question is, why did Ben Franklin change sacred and undeniable to self-evident? I think it's because it mattered, because it goes to the very essence of what makes something a human right. Now, scholars have been all over this exchange and this change in language in the Declaration of Independence. But one theory that resonates with me is this: that Jefferson's original version actually made these principles something that could be disputed. When you say a right is sacred, you mean it's ordained by God. But we may all believe in different gods with different rules, or we may not believe in God at all. In fact, that's one of the basic human rights we're talking about here. And claiming that a right is undeniable is really setting yourself up for failure, because a right is only undeniable until the moment that someone denies it. So that's why Franklin used a different term. He used the word self-evident. And it's a term that means something different altogether. It means that the right comes not from God or from ancestors who would not bear any alternative views, but from a common and inescapable human experience. What is that experience? I think one way to understand it is to do the following exercise. Imagine you're just about to be born, and just a moment before your birth, you can make the world any way that you want. It could be a world, for example, in which any person who's smart enough to be admitted to the University of New South Wales automatically receives a car, an iPod, a high-paying job, and a big mansion in the harbor. And everyone else can just wish they were you. There's just one catch. Once you choose that world, then you need to do just one more thing. You need to reach into a barrel with 5 billion tickets in it and pick out your ticket. And that ticket will define who you are, where you're born, the color of your skin, your genetics, your family circumstances. Are you smart? Are you athletic? Are you disabled? Are you born in sub-Saharan Africa, or are you born in a mansion in Double Bay? Understanding that each one of us could have gotten a different ticket immediately changes what kind of world we would want to live in. We would all want a world in which, even if you're not born in Australia, with the intelligence to attend the University of New South Wales and a family with the resources to pay for it, you would still want to make the most of your abilities and to create a life for yourself. You would want a world that allows you to adapt and that can adapt to you. You'd want a world in which you were free to think, free to espouse your views, and free from being enslaved or inhibited from developing yourself to your full potential. Every person feels that way. Every person. If they had the choice to choose the world for humanity and knew that they could inhabit any human life, every person would choose that sort of world. And that is why the truth is self-evident. Now, some of us were fortunate to have been born in worlds that resemble that world I've described much more than others. In the Asia-Pacific, nations like the United States, Australia, South Korea, Japan, New Zealand, and others, we have a free press. We have the right to free thought and speech. We have the right to travel freely. And in the 21st century, other nations, such as Indonesia, Timor-Leste, they've done the difficult work to win some of those rights, and they're still working to secure gains in other human rights. But our people of our nations, we work to help them and to secure those benefits for people of other nations. And we do this for many reasons. Some of them are simply moral, because we can and they can't. We have a voice and they don't. Some of them are a little bit more utilitarian, because if we don't protect their rights, then our rights will be imperiled as well. Because we know that countries that respect their citizens' human rights are more stable, they're less aggressive, they're more prosperous, they're better at providing security and at improving the welfare of those citizens. And this is why when Secretary Clinton, I was just back in D.C. with Secretary Clinton and a delegation from Australia, and we had a group of Australian and American dignitaries together at the State Department. Human rights was not an afterthought in her discussions of foreign policy. It was essential to it. She said that demonstrating to our neighbors in the Asia-Pacific region that democracy works and that it leads to prosperity over the long term is, quote, the most pressing work our alliance can do in the world, close quote. It's vital for our nations in the Asia-Pacific to cooperate in supporting the kinds of reforms that are essential to securing inalienable rights for all people in the Asia-Pacific. And that's why the work of this center is so critical. In fact, the work of this center is even more critical than that of some other human rights NGOs, because although human rights have to be protected everywhere, there's a special need here in the Asia-Pacific. Geopolitical forces have been shifting from the west to the east, and they're going to continue to shift to this part of the world. Asia-Pacific, with half the world's population, approximately the same share of its GDP, will be the main stage for the transformations of the 21st century. And so if we don't have human rights protected here, we jeopardize them worldwide in the future. So there are 4 things that we have to do to improve human rights in the region. First, create institutions that establish, monitor, and protect human rights. Second, focus on the core rights, the ones that are essential to securing all of the other human rights. Third, apply those standards to ourselves just as much as to any others. And then finally, to expose and to sanction abuses. Now let me talk about some of the human rights issues we face here in the Asia-Pacific region and what we're doing. And then at the conclusion of my remarks, we will unless Kevin Rudd arrives and takes all the questions away from me, I'll be happy to play Stump the Ambassador for as long as we have. So, as I said, our first step in this region is to create the types of institutions that foster international agreements on human rights priorities, the ones that encourage nations to work together to achieve them throughout the Asia Pacific. And some of these organizations have formed in just the past few years. The Indonesia's Bali Democracy Forum in 2008, the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights in 2009. As institutions like those make clear, there are some common understandings of what it takes to protect human rights of citizens in this region, and we hope to see the center here and the AHR continue to acquire the types of tools that make institutions strong, like a working complaints mechanism and independent expert commissioners to investigate abuses. And the second step is to ensure that the institutions focus on those core human rights that are necessary to the protection of all human rights. Specifically, what we've learned over time is that all free nations have three essential elements: representative government, a well-functioning market, and a vibrant civil society. Without these three elements, a society cannot prevent power from concentrating among one set of leaders and having them quash dissent and the essential rights of other free human beings. These are the protections upon which all of our human rights depend. Representative government, simple concept. Free countries have governments that represent and don't fear their own people. A well-functioning market. Free countries have markets that allow people to pursue their potential, reward people based on merit. They've got strong measures that guard against corruption. They promote transparency and fair governance. They uphold contracts. They respect property rights. And finally, a vibrant civil society. Free countries value societies in which there's debate, there's exchange, where thinkers think, and people can organize and petition and worship and complain and publish and tweet as they wish through peaceful means to improve themselves and their government. Because these rights, these three, are so basic to the human experience, they're not merely instrumental. That isn't, they're just means to just one end. They're means to all ends, as well as ends in themselves. And sometimes you'll see this. People sometimes suggest that human rights are either a tool of diplomacy or morality or economics, but properly understood, they advance all these things: national security, morality, prosperity, diplomacy, all of it. The only constant in America's rise from a small, weak nation to the nation that it is today has been those values. We don't espouse those values now because we're strong and powerful. We became strong and powerful because we've had these values. These are values that endure because they respect the essential dignity of human beings. Third, we must uphold them ourselves in this region and acknowledge not just our successes but our shortcomings. As the nations of the world become more interdependent, the fact is that human rights depend on events on all sides of our borders. Now, that's why the U.S. and Australia have been working together on human rights within our borders as well as outside them in the Asia-Pacific region. We know that we need to respect human rights within our borders and guarantee them to our own people, in part because of our own shortcomings in the past, our own mistakes, where we fell short of our goal. And there's no country in the Asia-Pacific that has a perfect human rights record, and the United States is included in that. But by being mindful that we're not perfect, that recognition alone, the fact that governments can own up to it and present it for public debate, is actually a sign of health and a recognition of health. We have political divisions that check and expose our excesses. We have robust media who challenge and educate us. We have voters who condemn our leaders when they fall short and who throw them out of office and force the next folks to do better. You may have seen our latest human rights report out of Washington. It discusses the human rights situation in 190 nations around the world, and it points out shortcomings in countries as diverse as China and Bahrain and Nigeria. But we've also produced a universal periodic review before the United Nations Human Rights Council, which also looks inward and assesses how the United States itself can continue to improve in achieving its own human rights goals. And that brings me to the fourth point. We can't be afraid to shine a spotlight on the practices of other nations that fall short of our universal obligations. This is true of small and large, weak and strong nations alike. As we said at the U.S.-China Human Rights Dialogue a couple of weeks ago in Beijing, and also in our annual human rights report, we and many other observers of China are dismayed by the disappearances, detentions, and arrests that have taken place in recent months, as well as increased controls on Chinese citizens who are seeking to express their views peacefully or to practice their religion. The United States believes that human rights can't be relegated to any one channel. We continue to press China to respect universal human rights, respect for the rule of law, support of a robust civil society and public participation, protection of free speech and free press, respect for minority cultures and religious freedom, and the free flow of information. All of those are critical to it being a responsible global partner and to effectively addressing the global challenges that we're all facing together, whether it's terrorism or economic crises, climate change, natural disasters, or health pandemics. But we also have to understand priorities, and in many ways we must place the greatest attention and the highest priority on nations that are of most concerns, the ones that not only commit abuses, but that also lack any mechanism to allow them to self-correct. And these are the nations that systematically restrict freedom and they deny justice. Let me talk about three examples where the U.S. and Australia are working together. In the South Pacific, we have Fiji, once a functioning democracy, but now under the rule of a dictator who staged a military coup, abrogated the Constitution, and is ruling without the consent of the Fijian people. Since that 2006 coup, the military regime in Fiji has not taken any credible steps to restore democratic institutions. It continues to suppress the rights of free speech and press and assembly. And this entrenched authoritarian rule, a rule by leaders who are absolutely indifferent to criticism, deprives the people of Fiji of their rights. And it's a very dangerous model for the region and for the global community. Both the United States and Australia, along with our other international partners and regional organizations, we've imposed sanctions on Fiji, and we continue to encourage greater respect for human rights and a return to democratic government in Fiji. We've pledged repeatedly to help Fiji take those real steps towards restoring civilian government and democratic rule, and that means more than just their holding elections that are false or charade elections. It means an open and transparent process for selecting leaders that includes participation of all stakeholders, and that the work is independent, it's inclusive, it's time-bound, and it doesn't have a predetermined outcome. Now let's turn to Burma. Last November, Burma held deeply flawed elections and subsequently formed a government comprised almost entirely of members of the prior regime, by surprise. This was a missed opportunity to ensure an inclusive, credible process to put the country on a genuine path towards democracy. Now, although the regime released Aung San Suu Kyi last November from 7 years of unjustified house detention, it continues to detain 2,100 other political prisoners, many of whom would contribute greatly to ensuring a more prosperous, peaceful future for the country, such as the many activists who were imprisoned for organizing relief efforts for the victims of Cyclone Nargis. The United States, Australia, our partners in the international community, are continuing to impose robust and targeted economic, financial, travel sanctions on the senior Burmese leaders and their business cronies as a means to press for meaningful progress on human rights. This is both a way to convince them that repression isn't in their best interest by hitting their own pocketbooks, and it's a powerful signal that we won't do business as usual with governments that fail to protect the rights of their citizens. And we've offered some carrots along with these sticks. I mean, beginning about a year and a half ago, September 2009, the U.S. supplemented its sanctions with an effort to engage directly with the upper reaches of the Burmese regime. But unfortunately, to date, we've received no substantive response to those engagement efforts. Their human rights abuses are ongoing, the political environment remains highly repressive, and tensions continue to simmer in Burma's ethnic minority areas. But that doesn't mean that we're not having an effect. Just recently, on April 1st, a newly installed government assumed power in Burma. The United States is going to work with Australia and others to urge Burma's new president to break with the repressive policies of the past, to respect basic human rights, immediately and unconditionally release political prisoners, and begin this credible, inclusive dialogue among all the stakeholders in Burma towards some kind of national reconciliation and a better future for the Burmese people. And of course, no discussion of human rights in this region is complete without mentioning North Korea. The U.S. Department of State's 2010 Human Rights Report declared that the state of human rights in North Korea remains deplorable, which is not one of those words that you normally get from diplomats, except in alleged cables. State security forces reportedly commit severe human rights abuses, and political prisoners are subject to brutality and to torture. Elections aren't free, they're not fair, judiciary is not independent, citizens aren't free to speak, assemble, associate, there's no free press. The U.S. and our partners here in Australia remain very deeply concerned about human rights in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And we've made clear that improving human rights conditions is central to any prospect of any improved relation with North Korea. As President Obama made clear, there's a path open to the DPRK to achieve security and the international respect that they seek. And they've got two paths that they can choose. They can travel along that the path that's available to them by meeting their commitments and their international obligations and respecting the rule of law and the rights of their people. But until they do it, the United States and Australia and other nations are going to continue to apply sanctions and condemnation. The U.S. has implemented a whole range of sanctions to North Korea, and we've not only implemented the UN Security Council resolutions, but we've adopted sanctions that are specifically focused on DPRK's human rights abuses and involvement in illicit activities. And we hope North Korea will respond. We're ready to return to dialogue and seek a resolution of the of the Korean Peninsula with Northern Korea, but they need to take the next steps. Finally, we all tend to talk about these troubled national situations, but we don't weave we weave human rights principles into everything we do, even things that aren't sometimes understood as human rights. For example, we're actively working in the region on preventing gender-based violence, trafficking in persons, and corruption. There is a profound connection between human rights and women's rights. As Secretary Clinton said 15 years ago in Beijing, women's rights are human rights, and human rights are women's rights. In fact, the State Department and AHRCentre and the World Bank were all co-hosting a meeting here in Australia in November to discuss how to prevent gender-based violence and to promote women's empowerment, particularly in the Pacific region. In Papua New Guinea, other Pacific countries, Many women experience domestic violence in their lifetimes. More than half are subjected to sexual assault. And when these victims have the courage to report the crimes to the authorities, they find themselves assaulted by the system as well, betrayed by an ineffective legal system and by the police. The prevalence of domestic violence is a symptom of much wider discrimination, where women are ignored in the workplace, and female education and literacy rates are far below those of men. The devaluation of women has, there's no way to describe the corrosive effect that it has on every dimension, within the home, within the economy, within their politics and society. When women have inferior access to health care, when they're less educated, when they've got limited access to credit, when they have virtually no voice in their country's economic and political activities, it crushes their ability to fulfill their potential. It damages and traumatizes their families and their ability to live to their potential. It inevitably leads to poverty, violence, and even greater insecurity. How well a country like Papua New Guinea succeeds in educating and empowering its women will be a key indicator of whether it, as a nation, can ever reach its own full potential. That's why, under Secretary Clinton's leadership, women's issues are, like all human rights issues, a priority of our foreign policy. And treatment of women needs to be recognized as a security issue, because when you attack the basic social unit of a family, it's a security threat, and it impacts development, it impacts human rights. And that brings me to my final point. That's ultimately my point. This is mostly for the students. You're going to be told many times, if you pursue this as a profession, a human rights lawyer, that human rights are a luxury. And when times are good, wealthy and secure nations can indulge greater protections for citizens and worry about the rights of people in other nations. But when threats arise, we have to focus on our national interests, even if that means sacrificing the rights of people outside our borders, or in certain cases, of our own people. This idea that we must either pursue human rights or our national interests is a false choice. Our national interests inevitably depend on the human rights of others. We will only remain safe, we will only remain prosperous, we will only make the world more stable and hospitable to our prosperity and security if we secure these values all the time, especially when it's hard. For all of you here, that is as much your challenge as it is mine. NGOs have greater freedom to expose abuses and to petition governments to change than the DFAT or the State Department can. And it works. It works what you do. Even the worst tyrants, and I've met a couple of them, they construct narratives that tell them they're good people. They rationalize and they justify and they delude, and without a free press or opposition to challenge them, they convince themselves that they're good people. And that's why international exposure and condemnation work, because it forces them to revise their actions to convince others that they're wrong, that indeed these tyrants are not abusive. As Justice Louis Brandeis once said, sunshine is the greatest disinfectant. So, thank you for your efforts. They're critical to the U.S.-Australia partnership as we move forward to secure the blessings of all, blessings of liberty for all, and ensure that one day all people in all nations will enjoy the right to life, to liberty, and to the pursuit of happiness. Thank you.